Welcome back to We Talk, and part 2 of chapter 2 of Jillian's book,
The Evolution of the Jelly Juice Protocol. Can humans live indefinitely despite their environment?
If you remember, I was speaking to having to fact check pretty much every statement Jillian makes. It's what I call the 10-to-1 ratio. 1 page of Drek, 10 pages of correcting said Drek. So far, she has demonstrated she doesn't understand biodiversity or what the microbiome consists of, believing that a protein is a living entity of some sort. Basically, Jillian so far spends the first part of chapter 2 redefining accepted scientific terms to basically suit her narrative of drink JJ. So we're going to continue in that vein. And our first case in point is this next passage. It's basically a bunch of nonsensical verbiage bandied as science talk. Quote,
Additionally, all of biodiversity send messages through biochemistry to their counterparts based upon the laws applied or the influences of the internal or external environment. In order for these messages to be accepted relative to their intention, the environment, which is made up of elements and compounds on the periodic tables, also must be factored in to determine if the laws of life or the laws of death will be applied. It comes down to balance, adaptation, and energy. All biodiversity has a balance of life within each cell that makes up each organism, and the cycle of life loops indefinitely like infinite fractals.
end quote. How does biodiversity send messages? What counterparts is she talking about? What are the laws of life or the laws of death? Okay, there are no compounds on the periodic table. It's a chart of elements. And what does intention have to do with anything? Now, continuing. Quote,
All of life can be broken down to energy or protons, neutrons, and electrons. These are all under the influence of the external elements in the environment and the internal elements within each cell, and each cell within each organism, and each organism within each ecological location. It is like going from the micro to the macro. There is no one type of life form more important over the other. However, we must understand what makes up biodiversity, creating all life forms.
end quote. We'll be coming back to her notion of energy a bit later, so I'm not really going to touch on it for the moment. But reading her passages is quite difficult. The rest of her statement is an example of Chopardis, i.e. Deepak Chopra. Basically, thoughts indistinguishable from a set of profound-sounding words put together in a random order to make a sentence. In her case, run-on sentences. But it gets worse. And I keep saying that, I know. Take a gander at her notion concerning proteins. Again.
Proteins are single-celled organisms that make up cells in bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and parasites, and they grow on various carbon sources for synthesis.
Now, Her source is from ScienceDirect.com topics. That's important because the topics page from Science Direct is basically a conglomeration or a collated abstract of different source papers. It's not just one paper. So she does not specifically choose a paper. Bear that in mind. So, what Jillian has done with this notion that proteins are single celled organisms is take a very specific type of protein, which is derived from agricultural waste, and then generalized to mean all proteins. She's again generalizing from a very specific definition to a very broad definition of what a protein is. Now, this is from her source page. I picked out what I thought was the closest to what she was referring to. Quote,
Single-cell proteins, SCP, refers to protein derived from cells of microorganisms such as yeast, fungi, algae, and bacteria, which are grown on various carbon sources for synthesis. This chapter discusses the present status of microbial SCP production from agricultural wastes and describes some of the technical and economical problems related to the production processes that must be overcome for large-scale applications.
so if you read further on, it describes a little more about the SCP and what goes on. Now, as I said, this is a collated abstract page. This is not a specific paper. It's not a paper that says proteins are single-celled organisms, okay? It does, but it's a very specific entity, or I don't even know how to phrase it. Very specific thing. So sciencey, I know. Now, I'm going to hazard a guess that this is at least the genesis of where Jillian gets the notion that proteins in general are an organism. Simply put, a protein is a biomolecule comprised of amino acid residues joined together by peptide bonds. Biomolecules are molecules produced by living organisms. As such, most of them are organic molecules. Basically, we eat proteins every time we eat meat, and obviously there are other things as well, such as beans. The components of protein molecules include carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, nitrogen, and sometimes phosphorus. The article that I cite in the show notes, if you want a good primer or a good overview concerning proteins, this is where to go. So generally, no, proteins are not single-cell organisms, as Jillian asserts. She's misrepresented or misunderstood. I'm going to say misrepresented her site. She either did so intentionally, or she just did not comprehend what she read. This next point, I'm going to assume, she literally pulled from her ass.
There are viral proteins not made up of cells, but made up of a single virus particle known as a viron, made up of DNA and RNA genetic material.
Now, her source, nowhere, states there are viral proteins not made up of cells, but made up of a single virus protein known as a viron. What her source does say, quote,
A virus is a small parasite that cannot reproduce by itself. Once it infects a cell, However, a virus can direct the cell machinery to produce more viruses. Most viruses have either RNA or DNA as their genetic material. The nucleic acid may be single or double-stranded. The entire infectious virus particle, called a viron, consists of nucleic acid and an outer shell of protein. The simplest viruses contain only enough RNA or DNA to encode 4 proteins. The most complex can encode 100 to 200 proteins.
Remember her little screed, "Oh, I study the syntax of the English language"? Well, here's a perfect example of her fucking failure. A or versus an. So she takes this explanation and totally twists it. But this next one is a whopper. And it tells you how disingenuous she is with her source material. No, scientists have not proven anything. Quote,
Scientists have proven that the first foldable protein was created by at least 10 amino acids in a very salty environment between 3.5 and 3.9 billion years ago. This type of organism that can live metabolically in a very salty environment is called a halophile.
the first part she has bolded and underlined. What the 2013 article summary actually states is this, quote,
Scientists may be a step closer to understanding how life first emerged on Earth billions of years ago. Researchers have produced data supporting the idea that 10 amino acids believed to exist on Earth around 4 billion years ago were capable of forming foldable proteins in a high salt halophile environment. Such proteins would have been capable of providing metabolic activity for the first living organisms to emerge on the planet between 3.5 and 3.9 billion years ago.
Nowhere does this article summary state prove. It does not appear. There is no such thing as proof in science. That's only in mathematics and logic. And this is a point a lot of science deniers miss or misunderstand. What the article summary is presenting is basically an outline of a paper in support of the origins of life as what they call proteins first or versus RNA first. I'm going to quote a little bit more just for the hell of it. Quote,
using a technique called top-down symmetric deconstruction, Blabber's lab has been able to identify small peptide building blocks capable of spontaneous assembly into specific and complex protein architectures. His recent work explored whether such building blocks can be composed of only the 10 prebiotic amino acids and still fold. His team has achieved foldability in proteins down to 12 amino acids, about 80% of the way to proving his hypothesis. If Blabber's theory holds, science may refocus where they look for evidence in the quest to understand where and how life began.
future me here. I stand corrected. They did use the word proof in this article summary, but I should point out that they're not using it as, at least I don't think they are, using it as one would say proof in logic or math, but more to demonstrate the truth or existence of something by evidence. It's more of a colloquial definition that they are using. But they did use the word proof, so I do stand corrected. So, simply put, this is an origins paper. And I do have the link in the show notes to the actual paper. Well, Jillian babbles on a bit more concerning proteins. I've decided to stop here. So far, Jillian has yet to substantiate any of her revelations. She has also failed basically at simply defining terms correctly. She makes up her own. She attempts, so far, to sound all sciencey, but when you read her own source material and actually read past the headline, it does not support her claims, does not support her assertions. This is just Jillian's opinion based on piss poor reading skills. Either Jillian has the reading ability of a 5th grader or less, or she's intentionally misrepresenting what she reads. Now, I'm going to let you, the reader, decide. But recently, some of her posts pretty much tell the story. I'm not sure quite yet how I'm going to weasel some of those in. It all depends on the further topics in her book. So you may or may not see them, or they might be a separate posting or video. So with that, next episode again, continuing with chapter 2. And bear in mind, this chapter is only 11 pages long. And this is what, episode 3? Just on chapter 2. And there's at least 2 more, if not 3. So this tells you how difficult it is to stop charlatans like Jillian. Now, granted, Jillian's charade is not as dangerous, and I hate to put this qualifier on it, as what we're going through with the COVID-19 misinformation. I mean, we just recently had a video taken down by YouTube and Facebook, and I think Twitter and TikTok, but I'm not 100% sure on those two, because these so-called doctors are saying that, use this hydrochloroquine, the anti-malarial drug that Donald Trump was touting and is touting again. You have these pseudo-doctors, granted some do have MD licenses, now saying, they're throwing out misinformation like it's nothing. So imagine trying to combat that versus combating Jillian. But anywho, I will see you next episode. I'm working on the recording and scripting for that one, as well as the blog post. And yes, they're 2 different focuses, so I have to do it piecemeal. Take care.